Yes, go ahead, Pablo.
Fabulous. Hello to you all. This is the session to cybernorms help or hinder incident response activities. My name is Pablo Hinojosa. I work for APNIC, the regional internet registry for Asia Pacific. I'm based in Brisbane, so it's late afternoon here. Welcome to all. We in APNIC are big fans and longtime supporters of the APrIGF, mostly because it is an awesome community that we are very proud to be part of. Also because APrIGF is a perfect place to bridge internet policy discussions with technical perspectives. APNIC is part of the technical community stakeholder group, so we try hard to challenge policy decisions for this to support and not affect the value of a global, open, stable, and secure internet. It is so good to see a lot of participants, currently around 51 on Zoom, but some others doing the streaming. And especially I want to welcome those that are young and to this community. Warm welcome to all of you. The first thing I want to share with you is that I'm feeling the pressure. The program committee accepted this workshop as part of the APrIGF program. It is a precious allotment of time, and it should come with a big responsibility, basically to make this workshop as fun, engaging, and inspiring as possible. This workshop expands on previous collaborations on the subject of cybernorms, which have started last year with a session in Vladivostok. Not sure if you remember it. It is on the record. We connected the APrIGF with the RSA conference happening simultaneously in Singapore. And we also have a history at the Global IGF 4 years ago with a group of friends. We were the first ones to organize a workshop on cybernorms there. This year, there were dozens of workshop proposals on this same subject, making it one of the hottest and most trendy topics at the IGF. Today, we're going to start from the beginning. We are going to talk about why cybernorms are important, but this is not only an informational session. We are going to go deep into the discussion and we'll make progress on this conversation. It is a topic that needs very much a multidisciplinary approach, for example, between governments, academia, civil society, and the technical community. It is also a topic that needs professionals on so many fields, research, academic, technical. So if we can inspire you to get involved, this is a subject with future. In particular, we're going to talk about the challenges of attribution, the process of accusation in cyberspace, whether naming and shaming help or hinder responsible behaviors online. We're going to talk about different perspectives. So from the academic perspective, we are honored to have a preview of an upcoming article on the subject by one of its authors, professor and friend Duncan Hollis from Temple University. It's 4 a.m. Where he is on, so we should be very grateful for him to join us. He's a fabulous lawyer, world-renowned academic focusing on international law. We also have Johanna Weaver, a top cyber diplomat, who is the representative of Australia at the UN Group of Governmental Experts. I'm also honored to have my colleague Adli Wahid, who is responsible for leading APNIC security engagements and comes from the security response community. I can see friends joining from civil society, academia, and technical communities. This is the multidisciplinary approach that we really need, and we welcome them to join in the discussions as well. Before I give the floor first to Duncan, then to Johanna, a few things. First, a chat room. Please use it. Let's keep it alive. And my first request is let's make it a challenge. Can you share your favorite reading material on cybernorms with us? What's the best article or website or source where to learn about cybernorms? Share your links, post them on the chat. The more links that you share, the more chances I will give you time to make an intervention. Second, questions. Please ask questions on the chat room as well to guide the discussions. I prefer questions to be asked via the chat room if that's okay. If you have an important thing to add to the discussion and it is relevant and focused and short, please raise your hand so I can give you the floor. So I would just ask to please give me a little bit of time to let the topic take shape, and for Duncan, Johanna, Adli, and a few others to unpack a few things before I open the floor. So I will start with Duncan to introduce the subject, mostly for the benefit of the APrIGF newcomers. There are plenty of them. You had a great metaphor in our session at the IGF in 2016 that cybernorms compared to dress codes, like we're not expected to wear a tuxedo in the APrIGF. So I wonder, can the same apply to virtual meetings to explain cybernorms? Maybe some of us are indeed wearing a tuxedo for this occasion, but you are not looking at it. Duncan, thank you so much again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pablo. Yeah, and this is my first regional APR IGF, so I'm really pleased to be here as early as it is in the morning for me. So if I seem bleary-eyed or a little less focused, I'll blame the midnight hour here, or 4 a.m. as it is. I think, Pablo, your point is an important one, as for those who are not familiar with the concept of norms, is to recognize that norms are around us as human beings all the time, right? We're social creatures, and there are a host of norms that we consciously or unconsciously follow every day, and they are kind of an inevitable part of our life. Sometimes we just do things by habit, right? So sometimes, I think the Zoom etiquette is different than the IGF etiquette, but is also different than a business meeting etiquette. Like, people will wear different clothing in different settings. So you have norms for different contexts. What do I mean? I think, let me just maybe start off before we get into the cyber part, like, what do we mean by a norm generally? And then we can maybe talk about it more specifically in the cyber context. A norm we often define as a collective expectation of appropriate behavior by members of a certain community. So it's a long phrase, but let me break it down into four ingredients, right? So first of all, norms are for communities, right? They're for community members. So, I'm a professor, so my students in my class, or students in classes everywhere, have certain norms of behavior. They'll show up, they'll pay attention, they'll take exams, and hopefully they'll pass the exams. But also professors have certain norms, right? I have to show up and teach. I'm expected to convey knowledge. And we can think about that in terms of, parents have norms, but so too do institutions, organizations, entities, and even, nation states can have expectations of behavior built around them, which is the second element of a norm. It's not just a community, it's expectations of behavior within that community. And that can be prohibitions, don't do this. It can be requirements. To be a member of this community, these are the things that are expected of you. These are the things you should do in some way. And norms kind of tell us what's appropriate and inappropriate. That's the third element of a norm. What is proper? What is improper? And the sources of that propriety can come from all sorts of places. So some norms come out of religion, right? Our religious dictates tell us what we should do or shouldn't do. Some are very cultural, right? That different cultures have certain norms. I liken to the difference, if anyone's ever been to, say, Germany, and it's 2 a.m. and you're waiting at a stoplight, people will stand at the light and wait for the green pedestrian sign to go to walk. Whereas in other cultures, everybody's just going to walk straight across. So, the idea is that, propriety can come from culture. It can come from socialization within a community, professional standards and training. It can come from law. The aspiration of law is to set a norm, right? By putting it into law, the idea is that people will then shape their behavior and expectations around it as subjects of that law. And finally, norms aren't just about an expectation of behavior around some certain line of what's proper and improper. They also are going to shape that expectation collectively, right? Norms are not unilateral dictates. They're not just directed at people. They're shared. We have to all expect it together. And sometimes that expectation will vary. Sometimes, kids, for example, there'll be a norm. Parents, we say, don't run with scissors. And, that norm is either internalized and the kids don't run with scissors even when the parents aren't around, and then sometimes it's not so internalized and they'll only, pick up the scissors and behave or put the scissors away when the parents are there. But when the parents are away, they'll run around with scissors. So internalization, how much do you actually make that norm part of your identity can vary. So kind of all of these elements are at play when we talk about norms for you and I, Pablo, or for other members of this panel, but also for industry and even for states. And that's when we talk about cyber norms, the conversation has been largely about what are the rules of the road for states. Right? What communities, whether it's states or other multi-stakeholders, what communities are there? What are the expectations of behavior? What can we do? What can we not do? What are we permitted to do? On what basis is this set in law? Is this culture? Is this shaped over time? And how deeply shared are these norms? So maybe that's just enough to tee it up. And to think about it as a general matter. And maybe Johanna, if I can hand off to you, you have pretty deep experience in the geopolitics and cyber diplomacy context. Maybe you can situate us into when we talk about cyber norms in the international space, what people are often thinking about these days.
Thanks, Duncan. As someone who famously tried to draw an analogy between cyber norms and washing your hands on the floor of the UN, I can say I should have used your analogies instead. Thank you. Pablo, I wanted to rise a little bit to the challenge that you set us in terms of how can I convince the listeners that the conversation around cyber norms and attribution is something that we need all of you to get excited about and be involved in. And so I thought I'd share just briefly why I find it such a fascinating area to be working in. So for me, my background, I was a commercial litigator. I then became a diplomat. I did a very standard Foreign Service posting. I then left the Foreign Service, specialised in cyber policy, and I've now come back into this field. And it really allows me to combine all of my loves. So it allows me to combine international law, foreign relations, cyber policy, but also the ability to act as that translator between technical communities and the policy communities and the operational communities. And I think everyone in this room, I'm sure, would have something to contribute and to help us enhance that understanding between those different communities. So why are cyber norms important? If you think about it, the rules of the road, if you take the phrase that Duncan was using, in terms of how it is that countries interact, what are the expectations of behaviour among countries? They, if we're talking not specific to cyber, they have developed over centuries. And we have a pretty clear view on what the rules of the road are in terms of countries interacting with each other. We know there are clear rules around, for example, trade. We know there are clear rules around territory. We know that there are clear rules, for example, around what we do if these, that there's clear procedures around what we do if there are breaches of the rules and norms. Well, in cyberspace, there are these norms, rules and principles, and we've actually agreed a lot. But there still is this pervasive view that cyberspace is in some way the Wild West, that countries can do things to each other in cyberspace that they wouldn't dare to do in the physical world, and that if they did do in the physical world, there would be really serious repercussions in terms of international relations if they did. So if you think about interference with a piece of critical infrastructure, for example, if one country sent agents onto another country, sent agents into another country's territory, messed about with the critical infrastructure of a few of your power plants, that would be a serious international incident. If they did it in cyberspace, it should also be a serious international incident, but is it? And really that is at the core of why cyber norms, why the conversation around international law as well is so vital in this space. And what I love about it in particular is that unlike many other areas of international relations where we engage, where those rules are set, and it's really focused on implementing agreements that maybe have evolved over a very long time. Here, you're very much involved in shaping what those expectations of behaviour are. That's not easy because, as Duncan says, when you're talking about norms in particular, it's not unilateral, and it is difficult to come up with an agreement among countries, among international, 193 countries in the negotiations, one of the negotiations that we're involved in. It's not easy, but if we are able to do it, it is really important. With that, I might hand back to Duncan to do a little bit more of a deep dive in terms of norms around attribution.
Thanks, Johanna. Yeah, I mean, one of the things Pablo mentioned at the outset is, at the global IGFs, we've talked about other norms that already exist. So particularly, I think one of the most prominent ones is within the CSIRT community. There are already kind of existing norms for information sharing and incident response, just as there are norms within the ICT industry writ large about, certain things that ICT companies will or will not do. And the question has become, when it comes to states, as they're shaping these norms, how do we know if they're working or not, right? Like when do we have a sense that the behavior is normative, when that is, it's normal? And one of the ways you can see that, I think, is through the rise in accusations or attributions, right? One of the challenges for cybersecurity used to be that victims often didn't know they'd been targeted. There was also the risk of quote unquote false flags, that you would think that you had been targeted by one actor when in fact it was another. And I think things have changed, right? Over the last decade in particular, attributions have become more frequent. More than 20 nation states, for example, now stand accused of having engaged in some cyber operation against a foreign, state or its citizens. And, and the question becomes, what's the value? What are the norms around these attributions and accusations? And, and I'd say, like, one thing is that there's been a sense, of course, that they kind of serve this notion of naming and shaming, right? That's what norms often do. There's a norm in a community, and if it really exists, you call out the violator, and the rest of the community either shames that violator or the violator feels shame. I got caught. I'll stop this behavior. I think the challenge for cybersecurity is, in many cases, we see an attribution or an accusation, and we don't see the shame that follows, right? Like the bad actors appear to still be doing their cyber operations. They either continue to deny it, or they suggest that it's somebody else is involved. And so that's a real challenge for us. But I don't think we should dismiss the value of attribution norms or accusation norms writ large, because I think they can still do other things, right? So I think when we think about accusations, they can also be there for defensive purposes. So, cybersecurity companies, states are making these accusations to share incidents of compromise or indicators of compromise with others around the globe, to say, hey, we know that there's this vulnerability and we want to make sure that it's available. And so there's a defensive purpose to this as well. It's not just about naming and shaming. There's a deterrence purpose. Sometimes the idea is you want to expose a bad actor, whether it's a nation state or a cyber criminal organization, to send a signal to others who might be contemplating similar behavior, to say, don't think you can do this anonymously anymore. We're going to be able to at least identify you, and that may change the calculus of whether you go forward. And finally, I think, going to Johanna's point, the mere fact of an attribution can help shape the existence of a norm, right? That they are constitutive, right? They help us constitute what behavior is acceptable, what's behavior is proper and improper. It tells us when somebody in the community hey, this is bad. Others in the community, whether it's a community of states, whether it's a community of ICT, whether it's a community of CSIRT members, others get to say, yes, we agree that's bad. We all agree there's a norm there. Or no, maybe we don't. Or you're part right. You're half wrong. But there's an interaction, an iterated interaction among members of the community through which the norm gets built, right, over time. And so I think one of the things we're seeing with the rise of attributions over the last several years is that there's this constitutive function that I think is really important. Just as it's important sometimes to stop norms from forming, right? Like maybe if states didn't accuse other states, it would be okay to target foreign elections. It might be okay to target critical infrastructure. And yet what we're seeing is states standing up and saying, no, don't do this, because they want to establish that that's against cyber norms to target, say, critical infrastructure. And, there's, a norm arguably building around that point, although not without some outliers. So, I think we could unpack this, attribution concept a little bit. What's going on? How publicly are these accusations made? Where are the condemnations coming from? Are you doing this? We say this is bad because it's a violation of international law. It's a violation of some, specific community norm. Is it a violation of some nascent norm candidate, or what have you? And maybe I'll open it up a little bit for others to weigh in as we think about attribution and where these norms around attribution might be coming.
Johanna, perhaps to wrap this introductory part and focusing on the attribution bit, what are the challenges? How do you find this subject in your own line of work?
Thanks, Pablo. Speaking as the person who had the honour and the privilege to draft Australia's attribution framework, I can say this is really hard. And it's hard because when one government says or makes an accusation that another government has done something bad, it has serious consequences, and we don't do that lightly. And I would say attribution, we speak about it so often in the cyber context, but as Duncan highlighted, attribution itself happens in many different areas around international relations. So probably one of the most public cases in recent times was when we had the Sheetal poisoning in the UK, and a large number of countries came out and said, Russia did this and it is not acceptable that this is happening. So it's not something that is unique just to cyberspace, but as Duncan mentioned, there are particular challenges in our context. And I think really you can define the challenges into three different types. One is related to the different elements of attribution. The second is the purpose for which you're attributing, and the third is the actors involved in an attribution. So the types of attribution, first of all, you have the technical challenge of attribution, which many of the people here can speak to much more authoritatively than I can. You also have the factual circumstances around attribution. So, for example, just because we can attribute technically behaviour back to an IP address in a certain country may not actually mean that that country is responsible for that particular activity. And there's also a legal dimension here as well. If it is happening on the territory of a particular state, can we, using the law of state responsibility, for example, or established principles of international law, actually attribute that? Each of those elements have different components to them, and they all need to be considered when you take a decision as to what you're going to do in responding to attributions. Which leads to the second set of challenges, which is around the purpose for attribution. So I can identify 4 purposes for which a country may choose to make public an attribution, but I would also say that not all attributions will be public. So it may be that we go through and we have legal, factual, and technical attribution, and then the government might take a decision to say, hey, actually, we think we can achieve our objective better if we have this conversation in private. But the purpose for attribution, first, is that we may want to bring attention to particular behaviours, to highlight it and to say, this behaviour is something we're concerned about. An example I'll give with this is in 2017, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre put out a number of alerts saying that companies and individuals needed to be aware that there was malicious activity targeting Cisco routers worldwide. It was extracting configuration data, and this was of concern, and providing advice on how to fix that. In 2018, we released an advisory which had an attribution saying it is the Russian state-sponsored actors that are exploiting the vulnerabilities in Cisco routers. The reason that we did that is because we saw that the advice saying there is a vulnerability that's being exploited wasn't being actioned. And so we made a public statement about it, attributing it to a particular government because we wanted the technical and operational community to pay more attention to it. Another reason is signalling, and this is something that Duncan spoke about, to say this behaviour is or isn't acceptable. And I think the Sheetal example that I gave before about after you had chemical weapons being used, to say this is not acceptable. And there are times when we will do that in the cyber context as well. The third is around deterrence. So saying we know that this activity is going on and we want it to stop. Now, you may at times include an attribution in that, or at other times you may not include an attribution. So you may or may not name a country. A good example here is the Australian Prime Minister came out a few months ago and said that Australia was witnessing large-scale cyber incidents against many, many sectors in the Australian economy. We didn't name a country, but we wanted to bring attention to that. And then the fourth is response. So what are we going to do? And I see this as a theme coming up in many of the comments here as well around, well, you can attribute the behaviour, but what are you going to do about it? And here you really do have the full suite of tools of statecraft available to respond, and I'm happy to talk more about that. Very briefly touching on the actors that are involved as well. You have the actors at an international level, so you may have the people asking you to participate, for example, in a coordinated attribution, and then you have a question about alliance relationships, about how we support our partners, the values that we uphold. But you also have the partners that you play with in a domestic context. So, for example, key actors when Australia is making an attribution are the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Home Affairs, but also Department of Defence and our Signals Directorate. Each one of those agencies brings with them different equities and perspectives that need to be balanced. And that is a really complex conversation depending on which agency is represented. And then ultimately attributions will be something that we need to take on a whole of government level. So no matter what context you're looking at, there is multiple layers of complexity. It's what makes it challenging, but also what makes it so enjoyable.
Thank you so much. I think that we have a good sense from the policy, international relations, and from the governmental perspective of the problem at hand. But I also see that there is a gap, and you mentioned about it, Johanna, in terms of the technical challenge for attribution. So I would like to open this space, starting with Adli, followed by Serge, about how the response community face the challenge of attribution from the technical perspective, and what do they think or see in the cyber norms coming up into shape, particularly if we are in the road towards implementation. Adli.
All right, thank you, Pablo. Hello, everyone. My name is Adli, and I am very pleased to be with you, all of you today, particularly in attending a session that talks about incident response and incident handling, and of course, attribution. Now, the perspective that I would like to bring in this conversation is that of a CERT, or the C-CERT community. And the reason for that is I had quite a bit of experience working with the national CERT, and then got involved with many CERT initiatives or activities, even during my days here at APNIC. Before getting into attribution, though, I would like to share a couple of points about incident response and incident handling, so that I think folks will appreciate the things that we are going to say with regards to attribution, and also so that people can see similarities and differences between the norms within the community and the norms developed by the UNGGE. Now, the CERT community consists both national CERTs and also enterprise CERT. So I think one misconception about the CERT community that it's all national CERTs. It is not. So in a lot of occasions, you have businesses who compete on the business side of things, but collaborate when it comes to security, either by sharing information or helping one another during a crisis, or even before you have an incident. And the relationship within this community is not strictly amongst the CERT. So the CERT do have extended relationship with the constituents, the community that the CERT is serving, either let's say a critical infrastructure for a national CERT, or even workers in an enterprise for like say a banking CERT. And that relationship then goes to the vendors who are providing software, or maybe the ISPs who is providing access, government and other stakeholders. So it's a very complex relationship, but at the same time, the CSERT community do have one clear goal, and that is when you have an incident, the goal is to mitigate the incident. And you can probably, and there's many example or comparison what a CERT is like. I normally like to use firefighters. Sometimes I use different example, but in this case, imagine a firefighter who are called to put out a fire. The immediate response or concern or priority would be to put out the fire, to minimize the damage that will be caused by the fire, and to make sure that the fire does not spread to the neighbor. And with this in mind, this is normally what goes through the mind of an incident responder when they are dealing with an incident. Yes, we want to make sure that this incident is mitigated, which means that it will not disrupt the business and minimize that impact. And also at the same time, I want my friends elsewhere to be aware of this incident so they don't experience the same thing, right? So the norm is to share, to outreach, to let folks know, because the common interest is that maybe in the future, if you observe similar things or if you experience something bad, you let me know as well so that I can protect my constituents. So that is important concept, and this is where sometimes attribution get a bit tricky, because now we start to want to shame and name folks. Now, before getting into that though, so this norm had existed way before, right? And it's not in written form. And reaching to another CERT happens, yes, maybe during an incident, but also many times it happens when there is no incident. So you see a lot of activities in the CSERT community where people basically provide technical assistance, share information, provide training. I remember back in the days when I was with the National CERT, it's very common to send experts to each other CERT to just share experience in doing certain things, right? How we work, what tools we use, how do you manage this kind of incident, what resources do you have in place to do your work. So that is very common. So it's a friendly environment, and where everybody is basically trying to help one another. And the expectation is also that when let's say, for example, I report something to you, hey, there's an attack coming from your economy. The idea here is not to put you in a bad spot, but more or less for you to work with your constituents to maybe eliminate that problem. Maybe there's a server was being compromised and now attacking everybody on the internet. But it is not up to me to decide what you need to do, but you then go and work with your constituents to make sure that this problem does not affect others around the globe. So the norms, as I said earlier, is not for reacting to an incident, right? There is a lot of sharing that happens before. And I would like to share just one story that I had experienced, and for the benefit of the audience here. In 2007, I had the privilege to be in a team that organized the APcert annual cyber drill. This is a drill that happens every year until today. And the team consists of Malaysia CERT and AUCERT at that time. And we were sort of preparing for incidents that would happen in the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And although the participation were mainly national CERT from around the region, many of the CERTs during the drill day had a parallel drill that happens locally. So local constituents benefited from that exercise. And again, the idea of the drill was if something bad happens during the drill, during the Olympics or the big event, then we would already know one another so that we can reach out to one another fairly quickly using emergency contacts and non-emergency contacts, but at the same time, sharing with folks who may not have the experience dealing with cyber incidents before the event, so that when there is an incident during the event, they know sort of what to do with it, have policies prepared, have the technical expertise, and know who to reach out to when they needed help. So I thought this was a very valuable exercise for all, not just for incident response community, but for the wider community when it comes to doing incident handling. Now, going to attribution, my last point here. Now, one thing that the CERT community always like to talk about to folks who want to discuss attribution is that you are not talking about a single actor, which is a nation state actor. You're talking about criminal gangs, insiders, people who work with organizations, individual fraudsters, and all of that. So there is a lot in that mix. So when we see an incident, just like the firefighter example, the immediate concern is to put out the fire, right, and learn how to protect yourself from it in the future. But we leave the who bit behind. And that is not because we're not interested, but because gathering digital evidence for a cyber incident is very complicated, especially if it involves multiple jurisdiction, and assuming that you can get that information in the first place. Second of all, there are authorities that are in place that does this kind of work, and normally the certs are busy and do not have the resources to maybe spend 2 years studying about a particular incident before arriving to who is behind that particular incident, because they have other things to do, and therefore not many of the certs are really keen to go into attribution right away. Of course, there are many examples where certs do collaborate with LEAs, for example, to do takedowns, and there are a lot of that examples in some of the recent cases. Now, I think I will stop there and get my friend Serge all the way from Geneva to maybe add a bit more on the attribution side of things.
So, hello everybody. My name is Serge Schwartz, and I am the acting chair of FIRST, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, which is kind of the umbrella organizations of all these CERT teams that Adli was referring to. And this whole discussion about attribution is always something that quite often ends up on CCERTs or CERTs desks, as a lot of the cyber issues do, because CERTs are very effective and they can solve a lot of problems, and people that don't really understand how they work then often falsely feel they can solve all the problems. And of course, that's not the case. We just one part of the puzzle. But let's go back of why do we actually need attribution? If we have norms, or if we believe norms are useful, then we need some form or some mechanism to actually figure out who's violating the norms. Otherwise, it's just kind of a nice exercise and kind of useless. But the problem, and it was pointed out a couple of times, that states increasingly do attribution, and that certainly is true. But the problem is that it's states accusing other states, and then the kind of game starts saying, oh, you should say this for political reasons, and we're not going to believe you. And that undermines the whole process of actually pulling someone or taking someone to responsibility. So what we actually would need to have is a form of trustworthy attribution. So attribution that's very hard to refute. And that's actually surprisingly hard to come out. There's ideas. Like one idea would be that instead of having states doing the attribution, it's a network of independent organizations that do an attribution, so that you cannot be accused of taking parts on something or not. It's just one of the ideas. But if you take this and say, okay, let's just take a group of people who analyze this, and we have an equivalent. The Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons works with a lot of labs distributed around the world that then give input in the hope this forms a concise opinion, where the accused probably still says, it wasn't me, but it's a lot harder to say. But if you actually go into that and start studying it a little more, what you find out, there's two things involved. The first one is what I call fact-finding. This is the finding out what is it actually that happened. And that's a technical job. That's something that incident response teams tend to be involved. It's already pretty tough. But actually figuring out from what happened to who did it, that's yet another step that in particular often the technical community is not very well suited to do, because what we are good at is saying, hey, there's a guy that attacked from this computer and that's the methods he used, but that doesn't tell me it was person X or Y that did it. So this really is a very hard thing to do. And I think it's important that we distinguish the fact-finding from the attribution. In particular, since fact-finding is something that a lot of organizations can do, attribution is something where at least some states claim, hey, this is state responsibilities. No one else should be doing attribution. It's a big discussion. It's also a discussion in preventing attacks with chemical weapons. For a long time, the OPVC's mandate has just been fact-finding. The other thing that I feel is very, very important to realize is that you can use the facts for different things. Attribution is just one of them. Another thing, and that's something that civil society keeps pointing out, is you can use the fact-finding to find more victims so you can help them. And if you're in the business of actually helping victims, attribution may be a wrong application. It may give away victims. It may actually re-victimize people or organizations that have suffered from attacks. So again, it's important to keep these things apart. And also, I think what makes the internet a bit special compared to all the other things is that the scope is so important. When we talk norms, a lot of people talk norms for states, but the internet has kind of changed this a little bit. In the internet, we have states as one player, but we also have the people that operate and own the equipment. Those are big tech companies. And we have the users, mostly from civil society. Johanna was mentioning the remaining 3.5 billion people that will come online soon. These people will have very, very different needs and challenges and problems from what states consider their problems these days. And in the norms discussions, we very rarely see these parts of the users, of the internet users at the table. That is a challenge, and I'm not really in a position to offer any solutions. I think some more work has to be done. But it is clear that this is not just a state discussion. We need norms that go far beyond what states do. And in fact, there is a lot more norms. There's of what people are supposed to do, like in private industry, there's a big discussion about should hackback be okay or not. And I think it's good that we have this discussion. And I hope we find good norms about that. Now, Adli mentioned the roles of incident response teams. And because we all nerdy, we the technical guys, we the firefighters, it's kind of easy to say, well, why don't you guys participate in the attribution game? And I would argue this is a very bad thing, because the firefighters are the good guys. They're the guys that everybody trusts. And if you start attributing, you may damage your trust. Trust is the fuel that CSIRTs or incident response teams run on. And CSIRTs depend on that. If in my team, I reach out to someone else across the globe in a different culture, in a different company, and a competitor maybe, it's important that I can do so with the other party knowing he's not going to take advantage of that. And so CSIRTs probably should not be part of the attribution movement or the attribution activities. And I guess this has to become some kind of a norm. And lastly, I think it's important that when we start forming norms and principles about attribution, that we really start paying attention to victims. Today, the information we have and that we look at completely ignores the victims. A recent study done by Leonard Maschmeyer, who right now works at ETH Zurich, showed that the information available in public reports from security companies and so on has nearly no overlap with information he got from civil society, meaning that victims in civil society go largely unrecognized. And this is a big problem. If we start forming norms and if we start building our attribution principles on just half the picture, we're going to miss out a lot, and we probably going to run into more problems re-victimizing the weakest in this game at the moment. So I think this is a great topic. It's a great panel here of top experts, and there's still lots of interesting work to do, and there's lots of work to do to make this world a better place. So I encourage everybody to really continue working on that. Thanks a lot.
Serge, thank you so much. I understand that you are in the Swiss IGF at the moment, so there is a nice connection between the regional Asia Pacific and the Swiss IGF. Thank you for joining. There are two sides of a conversation that I don't want to miss. One is from the civil society point of view, and Sheetal from Global Partners Digital may be able to support us with some comments, if that's okay. Afterwards, I will ask Anastasia to talk about it from the commercial and security vendor point of view, which I think will bring a good perspective. After that, if that's okay, I will open the floor to anyone that would like to contribute, although we're running short on time, and I would like to leave some time for Johanna and Duncan also to help us with some ideas for the synthesis document. So Sheetal first, and then Anastasia.
Thank you so much, Pablo. It's so good to see everyone here. Yeah, I've been thinking about these questions that we've been talking about for a while now, and it sometimes seems very difficult to describe from a human rights perspective, and Global Partners Digital is a human rights organization, so we come at these questions from a human rights perspective in a way that is convincing. And I was actually, as I sat down for this session, I was thinking about having my breakfast, because it's around breakfast time, and I thought, is it okay? Is it correct behavior to be eating, my breakfast at this time? No, it isn't, and I thought about that, kind of referencing a variety of different things, and that, that's a cultural norm, and that's a decision I made. But whether or not I eat my toast this morning in front of you or not is not going to impact your life. But the way that states behave, and whether or not they attack other states' critical infrastructure, whether or not they disclose vulnerabilities, whether or not they behave in a way that protects people's rights to privacy and data protection, that does impact your life. And that's why these norms are so important. And in particular, I think, we've heard a lot about attribution, because that's the norm that we're talking about today. And the GGE norm doesn't actually provide a lot of guidance in Norm B on attribution. And in particular, it doesn't say, and I think Johanna spoke to this when she said, it's difficult to get agreement when there's so many different perspectives, so many different agendas at play. So it's quite a kind of top level, high level norm, which requires interpretation. And in interpreting it, I think from a human-centric and human rights point of view, it's very important to continue to make the case that attribution requires the perspectives of a range of stakeholders, because cyber incidents do impact people. And that's one perspective, I think, that we do need to, as we just heard from my colleague just now, the impact of cyber incidents and cyber attacks and state behavior on human beings, that also needs to be brought to the fore more. And I think civil society can play a really important role there, as can other stakeholders, because although there are a very wide range of issues at play here, political and technical, ultimately cyber incidents and attacks impact people, and that's something that we really need to keep in mind as we have these discussions, and as we ensure that there are the incentives there to keep cyberspace secure, and not just a space where regime agendas or nation states kind of relationships with each other are driving behavior. So that's really important. But I'm going to stop there, because like you said, there's a lot to be said, and we don't have much time, but happy to engage in the discussion going forward. Thanks so much.
Anastasia. Go ahead, Anastasia.
Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this great session and for the opportunity to exchange the views between different stakeholder groups. I really like the point that Serge mentioned about the responsibility of not only states but non-state actors, individuals, users, companies in cyberspace, as we all operate in space. But speaking of the attribution and operationalization of the norm B, I'd like to probably make 3 statements. First, we have to delineate the different types of attribution and here probably I support the dimensions which Johanna mentioned before, and keep in mind that the latter is a sovereign prerogative of the states, I mean the political attribution, but there are also 2 other types of attribution that could be technical and legal one. My colleagues stick to technical attribution and specifically to boost technical capacities for technical analysis. There are different ways how to make it in a more automatic way, for example, using the code similarity technology, and thus to boost technical assessments across different actors in cyberspace. The second point is that for operationalization of the norm B, we lack methodologies, I would say. Yes, not all states actors do have capacities to make technical attribution, and for most states, attribution remains still to be developed capacity and capability. But even if there are some states that do have already capacities for that, I think that the community lacks commonly agreed and consensus-based methodologies and processes on the technical assessments of cyber attacks. And I think for us as the cybersec or ICT community, it would be almost the dream comes true to have greater cooperative mechanisms and methodologies that will actually explain the decision-making behind the attribution. If there would be a greater input from state level, together with the technical community on what are the particular proofs of the concepts and methodologies that on which we should rely our decision making, I think it would match much clarity, predictability, and stability to the space we all operate in. The third point for attribution, greater cooperation between national, non-national CERT and technical community at large seems very important, and not only in the direction of the info sharing, but also greater cyber incident exercises, where relevant response mechanisms in addressing ICT incidents would be developed. And here in particular, I'd like to mention that working quite often with Interpol or Europol, we often hear from those communities not only about the simply lack of cooperation across jurisdictions, but most of all about the lack of capacities and resources and capabilities that would be actually provided by legislation to tackle cyber threats. Finally, to address, I think, one of the biggest concerns that we personally have, they are fragmentation, growing militarization, and geopolitization of cyberspace. I think it's also critical to have preventive diplomacy mechanisms in place and perhaps leverage on here the leading role of the UN in interstate conflict resolution, mutual assistance, and conflict when, of course, the attribution, whether technical or political, actually already happens. So those are key points from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are eaten by the tyranny of time. I really want to leave some time for Johanna and Duncan to help us close the session, but I will give the floor to Anakin for a minute and Bronwyn for another one, and then come back to Johanna and Duncan afterwards. Anakin.
Hello, and this is Mika Kerttunen speaking. Anakin is here. We are very ecological. We share the same connection. Inspired by what Serge said about and many others of this need of different communities and why not different political camps to get together. Now we are talking about norms. They are voluntary, let's say, codes of certain behavior. they cannot be enforced, and I don't see any linkage between voluntary norms and deterrence that are, in my mind, more related to rules. So if we are to, I'm very skeptical towards norms, but I want to be positive. If we want to create norms, we need to share our thoughts with each other, horizontally and vertically. It's not by dictation that norms emerge. It's debate. Thanks, Pablo, for this minute.
Thank you, Mika. Bronwyn.
Thanks. My name's Bronwyn Mercer. I'm a security consultant with Microsoft. And so I guess I'm bringing the private sector perspective into this discussion, which is that I help organizations recover from major cyber attacks, and including public sector organizations. And something I see a lot is that private sector organizations are coming in and doing a lot of that technical analysis, working alongside public sector as well. So I think it's really important for that kind of the private sector to be on board with the norms development process, as well as they're often the ones who are kind of on the ground providing that initial technical expertise. I also think around attribution that there needs to be a high level of confidence and trust in the analysis that's being done at a technical level as well. As when I've been first on the scene responding to incidents, often we find that there's actually multiple state actors in an environment, not just one, and there might be evidence going back many years of old breaches that haven't been discovered until one indicator has set off a response. So there could be lots of things happening. It's not just one actor. That's it. So I think Adli mentioned that earlier. Thanks.
Johanna, help us out. What do you think about all of this?
Thanks, Pablo. Look, I think so many interesting points to pick up on there. So I think on the point of that Mika made, that norms are developed not by dictating that a norm exists, but by debate. I agree with you, and I think we're in sort of a false dichotomy in the sense that we have in the cyber context the dictation of 11 agreed norms. One of them is one we're discussing today, and yet practice may differ from that in some instances. But I do want to push back a little bit on the fact that norms can't be enforced. I think norms are enforced in social contexts. For example, if someone isn't washing their hands and it makes people sick, there will be repercussions for that. We'll tell them to go away, come back when they start using good hygiene. And in the context of cyber norms, when we respond, if a norm has been set, the response, or if you like, the deterrence element of that helps shape that norm. On the point around attribution and making attribution irrefutable, or that we trust it, and I think Serge, Bronwyn, Anastasia all spoke to this. This is an area that I think we could bring out in terms of follow-up work. I am very skeptical that we will be in a position where countries are comfortable delegating national security responses to an independent third party in the type of organisation like the chemical weapons that we have. But I think Bart made a really good point that not all countries have these capacities and capabilities. So how are we going to respond? So I think for me, what I would like to see as follow-up work is, well, what are the standards of attribution, or from a technical perspective, and from a policy perspective, what are the considerations that we make in terms of decisions to act upon all of the fact-finding and information that we might find around the technical elements of attribution.
What do you make of this session, Duncan?
I make it an hour is not enough time.
Yes,
So 23 seconds left. Let me make 3 points. Reiterating one, I think we need to distinguish norm candidates from norms. right? So I think, like, I don't know, Mika, that I'd agree that norms and rules are different. I think when norms exist, they are rules in some ways. And there are, as Johanna says, enforcement mechanisms. Second, echo the importance of multi-stakeholderism here. Norms are not just for nation states or specific nation states. There are multiple communities in cyberspace that each can impact the security and stability of the system. They can each have norms for each other, and you can form cross kind of, multi-stakeholder communities that can have norms within that multi-stakeholder community. You see the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace as an example of something like that. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, absolutely communication is essential here, right? If we're going to form communities and know what the rules are, we need the interactions that express views on what's appropriate behavior, what's inappropriate behavior. And I really will close out with I think we need much more discussion of what are the sorts of standards around attribution in terms of what technically we should be doing, when should we be requiring legal statements and the like, and what are the political value of these sorts of incidents, accusations, and attributions. But a great discussion woke me up at 4 a.m. So thanks, Pablo, for having me and for a great conversation.
Thank you all. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but I think we have good material. Edmund said that we're building the past, and past is power, and power is future. So we have this all recorded. The chat room was fabulous. I think we have a lot to unpack there, and I hope this has been a good contribution to the debate. One more for the collection. Thank you enormously to all. And if you have more to say, let's keep the dialogue running, not necessarily on this event, but outside in whatever medium. Thank you all.
Thanks, Pablo. We're closing the room now. Thank you very much.
Just 1 second. Can I stay to thank some of my speakers before?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Sorry.
So let me wait for others to.